The submarines lurked beneath the surface, awaiting their targets. Like hungry wolves, they prowled for convoys just below the surface. Radars beeped, engines whirred, and the crew communicated fluently in German with one another. The U-boats lurked near the coast of Norway, aiding in the invasion of the country, searching for Allied shipping. In the end, they'd send more than 3,000 Allied ships to the bottom of the sea. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. We're going to get into U-boats in World War II specifically, and at some point we will get into U-boats in World War I as well. For now, let's start with the end of World War I. World War I ended on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m. with the signing of the armistice. Fast forward 1 year later in 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, which placed limitations and reparations upon the German Empire. Germany's new Weimar Republic was now limited to 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats in total. Not for one division, but for the entirety of the Navy. The treaty also tightened the noose on the independent tonnage of ships and forbade the construction of submarines, being they were so damaging in World War I against Entente shipping. The Central Powers were also required to pay $33 billion at the time in reparations to cover civilian damage caused during the war, which equates to $1,052 billion in 2024. They were also required to forfeit ships and submarines to nations that lost shipping due to Germany's acts that were against the laws of war. Germany ultimately didn't finish paying off their World War I debts until 2010, and they were also responsible for paying about $3 billion after World War II, according to the London Agreement on German External Debts in 1952. This is easier on them than expected, since their total debt was estimated at over $300 billion at the time, which would be an insurmountable amount in 2024. The hideous, evil actions of past generations have plagued Germany for decades. In order to circumvent the restrictions of the treaty, a submarine design office called Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, or IVS, was set up in the Netherlands. The IVS was run by the Friedrich Krupp Germania Werft dockyard, and made it possible to maintain a lead in submarine technology by designing and constructing submarines in Holland for other nations. The IVS created designs for small 250-ton U-boats, medium 500-ton subs, and large 750-ton subs. Through the late 1920s and early 1930s, Germany had these 500-ton medium submarines constructed in Finland, acting as prototypes for the German Type 7 U-boat. And there were numerous secret projects up into the early 1930s. All were essentially prototypes for later U-boat models. Unfortunately for Germany, these secret programs were eventually exposed in the Lohmann affair, and as a result, the head of the Reichsmarine, Hans Zenker, had to resign. Erich Raeder, his successor, continued the policy of secretly breaching the Versailles Treaty. On November 15, 1932, a plan was approved for an expansion of the German Navy, which included U-boats. German citizens struggled greatly during the interwar period after World War I, including the major debt that Germany was forced to pay. Another challenge was hyperinflation. The German currency was almost worthless, to the point that people were burning money to heat their homes. Inflation was so bad that one loaf of bread cost 250 marks in January of 1923, and by November of 1923, this same loaf of bread cost 200,000 million marks. Unemployment plagued the country, and the housing stock was poor quality and in short supply. The German economy grew weakly, with low investments, low profits, and low export rates. This allowed for much political instability and social change, and this environment would allow Hitler and Nazism to rise, as he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, and the March 1933 Reichstag fire gave him the excuse to give himself full power with the Enabling Act. By 1935, Britain had noticed the increasingly apparent breaches of the Versailles Treaty, and they sought to control it. This concluded in 1935 with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, officially ending the limitation of the Versailles Treaty and allowing Germany to build ships in a 100 to 35 tonnage ratio to the British fleet. For submarines, the Germans obtained a parity in tonnage, but promised a 45% limit unless special circumstances arose. This allowed 24,000 tons for U-boat building. The ink was barely dry on the agreement when, after a week, the first of 6 Type II U-boats, U-1, was commissioned in the German Navy, and the name was changed to Kriegsmarine, meaning War Navy. Within the year, the Germans commissioned a total of 36 U-boats for a total of 12,500 tons. 21 U-boats would be commissioned prior to World War II, and in 1937, Britain announced it would expand its submarine fleet from 52,700 to 70,000 tons. During 1938, Hitler changed his tune about Britain. Originally, he'd wanted to avoid conflict with Britain, and in 1938, while still hoping Britain wouldn't interfere with his foreign policy, it became clear to Hitler that he needed a navy that could act as a deterrent. He wanted to invoke the escape clause of the naval agreement and to have 70,000 tons of submarines. Between May of 1938 and January of 1939, Raeder ordered 52 more U-boats to be completed by 1942. In 1939, the ambitious Plan Z was launched. It called for the construction of a German navy capable of challenging the Royal Navy. The plan included 249 U-boats for a total of 200,000 tons. But when World War II broke out only months after this plan was announced, only a handful of these planned U-boats were actually built. World War II began on September 1, 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, and at this time, Germany had 56 commissioned U-boats, of which 46 were operational and only 22 had enough range for Atlantic Ocean operations. The other 24 were limited to operations on the North Sea. World War II was heating up, but we're not opposed to cooling down with a quick break. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more from us, tune into our main show, Shipwreck Sunday, every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Alright, let's get into World War II. During World War II, U-boats caused as much trouble as they did in World War I. U-boat warfare was the major component of the Battle of the Atlantic, which began in 1939 and ended with Germany's surrender in 1945. Later on, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote, quote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Cross-Atlantic trade in war supplies and food was extensive and critical for Britain's survival, and the continuous action surrounding Allied shipping became known as the Battle of the Atlantic." Convoying had been a key factor in the fall of German U-boats in World War I, and thus the British began organizing convoys at once in September of 1939. During 1939, Germany tried to clap back and attack convoys with their new Wolfpack tactic, but this was unsuccessful. The invasion of Norway in April 1940 halted temporarily all U-boat operations against merchant shipping. During the invasion, many technical problems with the German torpedoes were exposed, and only in August of 1940 could the U-boat attacks on convoys resume. Now there were fewer U-boats in operation than at the beginning of the war, but thanks to new bases in France and Norway, U-boats could reach their operation grounds far easier. During the following months here, the Wolfpack tactics were revived with spectacular results for Germany. This was prior to the Allies developing truly effective anti-submarine war tactics, and was referred to by German submariners as die glückliche Zeit, or the first happy time. By the beginning of 1941, British countermeasures began to take effect. In March of 1941, the 3 leading U-boat aces were sunk during convoy battles. In May of 1941, the British were able to break into German secret naval Enigma communications, and then rerouting convoys to avoid U-boat concentrations. When American warships began to escort Atlantic convoys, the U-boats were restricted in their operations, as Hitler did not want the U.S. involved. The campaign against merchant shipping was further impeded when Hitler interfered twice. First, he insisted a small force of U-boats stay stationed in the Arctic as a precaution against a possible Allied invasion in Norway. And secondly, he ordered a substantial force of U-boats to operate in the Mediterranean in order to support the Italians and Rommel's Africa Corps, the German expeditionary force in Africa during the North African Campaign of World War II. Americans entered the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and afterward, the focus of U-boat operations shifted to the Atlantic coast of the United States and Canada, where no convoys were organized and anti-submarine measures were inadequate. There followed a second happy time when U-boats could extend their successful operation to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. By mid-1942, adequate defenses were brought about in these areas, and the U-boats returned to their old hunting grounds on the North Atlantic convoy lanes. This renewed aggression toward convoys reached its climax in March of 1943, when 2/3 of all ships sunk were ships and convoys. The Allies were able to put effective countermeasures into effect, and only 2 months later, on May 24, 1943, Karl Dönitz had to stop the campaign due to heavy losses. By the end of World War II, almost 3,000 Allied ships, breaking down into 175 warships and 2,825 merchant ships, had been sunk by U-boat torpedoes. This resulted in the deaths of over 30,000 people just by U-boat alone. In total, 1,131 U-boats entered service before the German surrender on May 7, 1945, of which 863 had executed war patrols and 785 were lost. Of the 154 U-boats surrendered, 121 were scuttled in deep water off Lisa Northern Ireland, or Loch Ryan, Scotland, in late 1945 and early 1946 during Operation Deadlight. Though U-boats were known to patrol the Atlantic, one U-boat lurked near the United States off the East Coast, prowling in the Atlantic Ocean. Insignificant, unsuccessful, and little known, this U-boat was shrouded by mystery until the early 1990s. When was she sunk? What happened to her? How close to the US did she get? You'll have to wait and see this Sunday for the story of U-869.